Okay. Hi, everyone. Just quickly introducing myself. My name is Cassandra Sawyers, and I am the ILS Research Assistant. I just quickly wanted to start off by a land acknowledgement, and I invite you to also contemplate of the land that you are occupying right now. I acknowledge that I am on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and I thank them for having cared for this land and look forward to the presentation.
All right, I will introduce our two librarian speakers. I'm going to start with Carleen. Carleen is the Information Services Librarian at Xwi7xwa Library. She is Anishinaabe from Laxol First Nation, Cree from Barons River First Nation and settler, and was born and raised as an uninvited guest on the unceded ancestral and traditional territory of the Seal Okanagan people. She received her BA from UBCO in Indigenous Studies and Gender and Women's Studies, and afterwards she earned her Master's in Library and Information Science at the iSchool at UBC Vancouver. And Kayla is our Indigenous Programs and Services Librarian at Xwi7xwa Library. She holds a Bachelor of Native Studies and a Master's of Library and Information Studies from the University of Alberta. Her professional areas of focus include Indigenous librarianship, Indigenous data sovereignty, and embedded librarianship with Indigenous communities. Prior to her current role, she was an Indigenous academic resident at the University of Alberta Libraries, where she primarily worked in the Digital Initiatives Unit. She is of Métis background, and she's also the Program Manager Librarian for the Indigitization Program.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Carleen, do you want to share your screen and we will get this started?
Can somebody please make me the host? Kayla, I think you're the host now. Can you make me the host?
There we go.
Sorry, I just have to move you guys out of the way now. Kayla, do you know how to get it into
Yeah, it's down at the bottom beside where it says 71%. There you go. Okay, so welcome everybody to the Xwi7xwa Library ILS Research Series presentation. Today, Carleen and I will be giving presentations on our kind of specializations respectively. So this is the outline. We're just going to do a quick introduction because we already kind of did an introduction. Then I will give a presentation on Indigenous knowledge sovereignty and how it clashes with Canadian copyright law. And then Carleen will be giving a presentation on how the Xwi7xwa Library indigenizes terminology with a comparison to Library of Congress, and then how to contact us after.
So although I know that we're all working and studying and coming in live from different areas right now, UBC Vancouver is located on the Musqueam territory, and we just wanted to acknowledge that they are occupying ancestral and unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam people. I am currently coming from the shared territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples.
So this is just a little bit more about me. So as Tama said, I am originally from Treaty 6 territory in Xwi7xwa again. I was born and raised in Alberta. I do have a Bachelor of Arts in Native Studies, and I did that in 2016. I graduated. I completed my MLIS from the University of Alberta in 2018. I was an Indigenous Digital Initiatives librarian at the University of Alberta from 2018 to 2020. And I also am a sessional instructor for the University of Alberta Library and Information Sciences Department, and I've been doing that since 2018. At UBC, I'm the Indigenous Programs and Services Librarian, and I also am the Program Manager Librarian for the Indigitization Program. I also sit on the CFLA Indigenous Matters Committee as the team lead for data sovereignty, intellectual property rights, and traditional knowledge. And I'm also on the Canadian Federation of Library Associations Copyright Committee.
Hi, I'm Carleen Delorier-Lyle. Delorier is from my mother's side and Lyle is from my father's side. My families are originally from Lac Seul and Barons River, and a whole mix of settler ancestry as well. I was born and raised on unceded ancestral and traditional territory of the Okanagan people, where I lived up until a few years ago. And I moved to the coastal area so that I could get my master's in library and information studies. I've been here ever since, and I transitioned from a student into a full-time position as the information services librarian, which essentially means for all of you that if you have any more difficult research questions, then I will more than likely be looped in on those questions.
All right, so Indigenous knowledge sovereignty. And I'm just going to give a quick disclaimer with this. I am not a lawyer of any type, so this is just based off of my personal interest in Indigenous knowledge sovereignty, Indigenous data sovereignty. However, I hope this presentation might inspire some future lawyers to go into copyright and intellectual property law so that we can, make some changes in the future when it comes to Indigenous knowledge and how it fits into copyright law. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I just wanted to start off this presentation with this quote, and it goes, "Colonized minds hear ours and think possession. Decolonizing minds hear ours and think connection." So what are Indigenous knowledges? So throughout this presentation, I will be using the word Indigenous knowledges or Indigenous data, and Indigenous knowledges normally have at least 5 characteristics, and that they are personal, they're orally transmitted with exceptions, they're experiential, they're holistic, and they're narrative. And Indigenous knowledges evolved from traditional knowledges, which are living chronicles of origins, trajectories, and achievements of Indigenous people, empirical knowledges, which are careful observations, relationships to humans and non-humans. They are usually ecological and accumulated over time. And revealed knowledges. And revealed knowledges are sometimes revealed through visions, intuitions, or dreams. So traditional knowledges. This is usually what we hear when we're thinking about intellectual property rights or knowledge rights within a copyright sense. So traditional knowledges are knowledges, know-how, skills, and practices that are developed, sustained, and passed from one generation to another within a community, and it forms a part of cultural or spiritual identity. However, there is no real universally accepted definition of traditional knowledge, but in general, it can be said that traditional knowledge, in a sense, embraces the content of the knowledge itself, as well as traditional cultural expressions, including distinctive signs and symbols associated with traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge in the narrower sense refers to knowledges as such, in particular, that knowledge is resulting from intellectual activity in a traditional context and includes know-how, skills, practices, and innovations. And you'll notice throughout this presentation, I tend to use the word knowledges because there's more than one type of traditional knowledge. We don't want to pan-indigenize anyone. So traditional knowledges, and I'm very cognizant of the fact that I am capitalizing knowledge and knowledges as I go through. And then also we have traditional cultural expressions. So traditional cultural expressions are also called expressions of folklore in some cases. Many include music, dance, art, signs, names and symbols, performances, ceremonies, architectural forms, handicrafts, and narratives, or many other artistic or cultural expressions. It may be considered as forms in which traditional culture is expressed, a form that is part of the identity or heritage of the tradition or the Indigenous community, and they are normally passed down from generation to generation. Indigenous knowledges are also passed down from generation to generation, making them intergenerational knowledges. So Indigenous data sovereignty. So Indigenous data sovereignty is one of my passions. It's something that I feel very, very strongly about and would like to explore this a little bit more. So Indigenous data and knowledge sovereignties, because it's not always just the data that's being produced, but also the knowledge. And data sovereignty is the management of information in a way that aligns with the laws, practices, and customs of the community in which it is located. In the Indigenous context, it may manifest at the group or family level. And often when we see Indigenous data, it can be anything from oral traditions that have been transcribed, photographs, data sets, video recordings. So it manifests in many different ways. And it can be information that's health related, demographic, traditional knowledge, pretty much anything is incorporated under this blanket of data. So Indigenous data sovereignty is the right for Indigenous people to govern the collection, ownership, and application of data about Indigenous communities, people's lands and resources, regardless of where it is held and who owns it, and who from outside the community may claim to also own this data. Indigenous peoples also have the right to access data that supports nation rebuilding, and this often includes government documents, historic and contemporary archival documents. Some of the more recent events that we've seen that have happened that include this nation rebuilding is the releasing of archival documents that had to do with residential schools in Canada, and also the releasing of documentation that is about the 60s scoop. So any of those big kind of movements that we have where we need to be thinking cognizantly of what information is being shared publicly and who should have access to this data and the right to have access to this data is important. So data and power. So I often like to kind of throw this in. So when we're thinking about data and power, those who are in control of the collection, dissemination, and preservation of data often are in the position of power. For years, when we think about researchers have been in the position where they are in control of the flow of data, and Indigenous communities have largely been left out of this conversation, which really throws off the a power balance in the relationship between the Indigenous community and the researcher. So not only that, but data rights are human rights, and data rights also should be considered Indigenous rights. So Indigenous knowledge, intellectual property rights, and copyright. So Canadian laws have worked not only to ignore and/or specifically deny the rights of Indigenous people to practice and maintain their culture and intellectual property, but it also has legalized the theft of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property through the Canadian Copyright Act. And this is not just Canada specific. There are many copyright acts around the world that also do the same to Indigenous knowledges and intellectual property rights. So this is some very in-your-face wording around it, but this is a very serious issue within Canadian context and a international context when it comes to, you know, the legalized theft of Indigenous culture and property. Traditional knowledge and copyright in Canada, and this is from Younging 2010, and this is a paper that was given to WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization. And so when it comes to Indigenous knowledge and copyright in Canada, these are the main issues with Indigenous property rights and the imposition of traditional knowledge, and the imposition of it on traditional knowledge in Indigenous communities. So expressions of traditional knowledge often do not qualify for protection because they are too old and therefore supposedly in the public domain. When we're looking at copyright law, it's kind of around the Mickey Mouse clause, which follows Disney, and whether or not Mickey Mouse, when it that figure comes out of copyright. So it keeps on getting pushed. Last time I checked, it's about 75 years. It's in the public domain. Also, the author of the material in some cases with Indigenous knowledges is not often identifiable, and therefore there is no rights holder in the usual sense of the term of a rights holder when it comes to copyright. As well, traditional knowledge is often owned collectively by an Indigenous group for cultural claims and not by individuals or corporations for economic claims. So when we're looking at Indigenous intellectual property rights and Indigenous traditional knowledge protection, there are different types of protections that we can put or aim to put in place. And these are defensive protection and positive protection. So if you're looking at any WIPO documentations, often they will talk about different types of defensive protections that are being put on Indigenous knowledges around the world and different types of positive protection. So defensive protection aims to stop people from outside of the community from acquiring intellectual property rights over traditional knowledge. And positive protection is the granting of rights that empower communities to promote their traditional knowledge, control its use and benefit from its commercial exploitation. Some uses of traditional knowledge can be protected through existing intellectual property systems, and numbers of countries have also developed specific legislation. However, any specific protection afforded under national law may not hold for other countries. One reason why many Indigenous and local communities, as well as governments, are pressing for international legal instruments is because of this. Okay, so one thing left about anything with WIPO and sorry, Carly, and intellectual property is that they often do meet. They meet about twice a year to discuss traditional knowledge, folklore, and also genetic information with Indigenous communities. So if you are interested in this a little bit more, feel free to reach out to me. They just met in October, and sometimes they do actually record the sessions and the seatings that they have. So if you would like to watch any of the live sessions where they're actually going more into depth about this, or if you'd like any other tools or contact information about data sovereignty and traditional knowledge, feel free to reach out. And at the end of the presentation, we will also give our contacts. So, yes. All right, take it away, Carleen.
Thanks, Kayla. For my portion of the presentation, I will be talking about indigenization of terminology, and I'll be speaking about it from the perspective of Xwi7xwa specifically, but also within the context of UBC Library. And we'll be doing a comparison to broader international and global terminology classification, all that. We'll get into it. But I just wanted to make sure before I begin that we all have a foundational understanding of what I mean by classification and subject headings, so that I'm not using library jargon and then I completely lose you. So what you're looking at on this slide is on the right-hand side, we have a book, Aboriginal Self-Government in Canada. And when UBC Library purchases this resource, someone sits down and they say to themselves, okay, what are the main topics of this resource? So the most topical level, we've got Indigenous peoples, Canada, politics and government. So you can see how it starts to get more granular. And they're using terms based off what they think their patron or our patrons are most likely to use. And this is important for accessibility because you won't be able to find something like an information source can exist. But if you have an inability accessing it, then it's kind of useless, right? So based off of these subject headings, we will say to ourselves, okay, we have to now figure out how we're going to take all of this knowledge and all of this information in our branch and organize it in such a way that also makes sense to our patrons. So the subject headings impact the classification, and the classification system is essentially it organizes subjects, but it does so alphabetically. So the subjects correlate to a letter so that when you get into the branch, we've shelved everything alphabetically, and more relevant resources are going to be closer on the shelf to one another, and resources that are less relevant to one another will be further apart. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side is called an item record. And an item record has all of the descriptive pieces of the resource so that you can search it, right? So we've got things like the title, the author, place of publication, all that kind of stuff, if you know the item. But if you're just searching for a topic, that's where the subject areas or the subject headings really come in handy. So I just want to backtrack a little bit before Xwi7xwa became, before it was built. The Library of Congress is the world's largest library, and it is in the United States. They also have a classification system and use subject headings in order to organize their information. And the library and their organization systems were developed in the 19th and early 20th century. So this classification system and subject headings, they still exist today, and they are dominantly used in academic libraries. So the reason why people are using them in different places is because they want to create a standardization. So theoretically, if one of us were to be at Kerner, or if we were to go to the Okanagan campus, or even if we were to go to the University of Toronto, when we go to the library, if it's all standardized, then we'd be able to find information no matter where we were. So I want to complicate this a little bit. On the left-hand side, what you're looking at is the Library of Congress's classification outline. So this list, as you can see, starting from A to Z, on the left-hand side, all of those letters are the classification and then the correlating subject heading, right? So for you folks, one of the relevant areas is going to be the classification E, which is the subject heading for History of the Americas. And when you go to the Library of Congress's website, you can click, all of these are hyperlinked. When you click on them, you get a longer list. You're actually linked to a PDF, and it becomes more robust, so you can see a better breakdown. For example, under E, we've got America, general, elements in the population, North America, and then we can start to see things like pre-Columbian America, the Indians of North America, Indian wars, Indian tribes and cultures. So I want to remind us that this was created in the 19th and 20th century, and these are not terms that we typically use in everyday language, especially depending on who you're speaking with. The other section that I want us to pay attention to is the classification for K, which correlates to law. So when you click on this hyperlink, again, if you were to scroll down, so you have K for law, KE is for Law Canada. And then if it gets further broken down, as you can see here, for KE1, or KEA, sorry, is for Alberta. KEB for British Columbia. We'll just forget about all the numbers and stuff on them that follow. And then you get KEM for Manitoba. So again, what's happening here is it's not organized geographically. You're getting an alphabetized list of colonial borders and places. So what does this mean for Indigenous knowledge within Library of Congress, or how do they relate to one another? Under the E classification for History of Americas, this is problematic because anything that is written by us or about us will go into the E, typically will go into the E classification, which is the history section. Even if one of my coworkers were to publish a book tomorrow, it would go under E. And this is problematic because it historicizes us as Indigenous people. It also is using outdated terminology and it's alphabetizing our nations and communities. So even though Manitoba is not as close to Alberta or BC, they've alphabetized it in this way. If we look under KE for law, you get your legal boundaries. They're organized provincially, federally, but it also reinforces the colonial boundaries and borders. So instead of using the Library of Congress, Brian Deere, a Kahnawake librarian who passed away a few years ago, created the Brian Deere classification system. And he was tasked with creating this classification system for the National Indian Brotherhood, today known as the Assembly of First Nations. So what he did is that he created this so that the Brotherhood would be able to organize their information, but also be able to access it. And he did so that it would make sense. It was organized in a way that makes sense from an Indigenous perspective. And the nice thing about his classification system is that it can be adapted depending on where it is. So Xwi7xwa has our own way of organizing our information. And another example is the Inalkin Center, which is in Penticton. They have their own adaptation of the Brian Deere classification system. So they're able to organize it in a way that makes sense to them and in a way that makes sense to the community. Our subject headings in our branch are called the First Nations House of Learning subject headings instead of LC. So for you as law students at the UBC Vancouver campus, what does this mean for you? Well, when I speak specifically for Vancouver, not for the Okanagan campus, you have a total of 13 branches. We typically are using the Library of Congress subject headings, but also the FNHL subject headings. And the two branches that are most relevant to you are going to be the law or the law library and Xwi7xwa library. So what I want to do is just give you an example of how our way of organizing information and knowledge, what that looks like from your perspective when you search in the UBC catalog. So as I was saying earlier, each of these records, or these records, both of them, they represent a physical book somewhere or an ebook or a resource, right? And they each have their own information, they have different holdings, all that kind of stuff. They live in different places. So on the left-hand side, what we're looking at is the book Indian Women and the Law in Canada, Citizens Minus. And if you look down, you can see that there's one located in Irving K. Barber in storage. There are 4 in the law library, and the Okanagan has 1. If you look at the call numbers, and you just forget about all the numbers for now, and the letters, just the first ones, what you can see is KN, KE, and E. And if you look under the subjects, you're getting Indians of North America, and then it gets more granular, the legal status, and then so on and so forth. You're also getting women, legal status, and then more granular. On the right-hand side, what you're seeing is one resource in Irving K. Barber, which is for Xwi7xwa's storage space. We also have another copy in special collections that can't circulate. And then we have another one that lives in the stacks, which means that it can circulate. We have 3 copies. And the first, so what you're seeing is also PR for our classification. And then underneath subjects, you have Aboriginal Canadians, women, law, legislation. We also have Indian Act and membership. And then we have Aboriginal Canadians, Bill C-31. So if the record on the right-hand side did not exist for this resource, when you search in the UBC catalog, everything that you see on the left, so Indian and women, law in Canada, those are your keywords. But some people, depending on our perspectives, might not think to look up Indian women. We might think, no, I want Bill C-31 specifically, or maybe I would like to use Aboriginal and Canada as keywords. So if the Xwi7xwa record didn't exist, you would be at the whim of the left-hand side. And that's the importance of having both of these speak to one another and having them linked. So what I was talking about earlier when I was saying just look at the beginning of each of those call numbers. If we do a breakdown, so if I navigated back over to the Library of Congress's outline for their system, KN is for Asia and Eurasia, Africa, Pacific area, and Antarctica. KE, Canada Law, E, History of Americas, and at Xwi7xwa, P is for Community Resources. More granular than that, we have PR, which is Racism, Stereotypes, and Race Relations. So within that classification system, when you come into the branch, when you can come into the branch, then you're going to find all of those resources really close together. And that's important for you as law students because you should be able to have access to these resources very easily. You shouldn't have things like spread out all over the place, right? It makes it more difficult. So what we just want to really get through to people is that sometimes, and especially when you're searching in archives, we might need to use outdated terminology that we aren't going to be using in everyday language, or depending on, you know, who we're speaking with, who we are, and what we know, and our relationship with them. But when you're doing research, sometimes you will have to use these things in a situation that you typically wouldn't. I also want to talk about translating perspectives, or Kim Lawson used to call this code switching to me. So one of the things that I would typically encounter at the reference desk or when working with folks is people will come in and they'll say, I'm Indigenous, or I'm interested in Indigenous law. But I want something that's like pre-colonial. And so I'm thinking, oh, like traditional governance. And as we sit there and have this conversation, it's just a new concept, or, you know, and as Kayla and I have said, we don't have, we're not lawyers. So there's also that code switching that we have to do when we have conversations with folks with legal backgrounds and stuff as well too. So there's a bit of that as well, thinking about not only our perspectives, but how our subject areas influence the keywords and the words that we're using and the terminology that we're using when searching. And then to further complicate this, no, just kidding. Databases can also, you know, just be aware that I'm speaking specifically about the UBC catalog. So I haven't even really delved into databases yet. So just continue this practice when you're searching in databases as well. And just a little helpful tip is when you get into a database, see if you can find out if there's like a help section or a search tip section, because they'll give you things, for example, like in the Canadiana Aboriginal History database, I found that if you do TI : in front of a word or phrase to search, then you're searching documents by title. This can be helpful or not helpful. So I know sometimes you'll pick up a book and it's got a title with a lot of flair, and it has to do with Indigenous law, but it might not have Indigenous or law in the title, or it might have law but Aboriginal and not Indigenous. So it's just being aware that you're limited in that way. Whereas if you did SU with a colon in front of a word or phrase to search subject headings and keywords, then you're searching the subject heading, some of the other content as well. So there's little tricks to be able to find information as well and make it a bit easier. And finally, I just wanted to finish off with a quote from our head librarian, Sarah DuPont. When Aboriginal peoples go looking to find representations of our many diverse knowledges in the library collections, we should be able to search using terms we use to describe ourselves. We should not feel the sting of antiquated, colonial, and racist words that perpetuate negative connotations of us, especially when we and our allies go to do the work of lifting academia and broader society out of these shadows through our scholarly efforts. So that's the importance, I think, of Xwi7xwa, and what our library technician is doing right now is she's creating accessibility for all of our students. Oh. Finally, I just wanted to leave us off with some contact information. We'll leave some space for questions, but I wanted to leave this up so you have both Kayla and I's contact information as well as Sarah's. And as we've said before, without the law background, it's always a good idea to contact us in addition to the folks at law, because I think when we work together, we can really create a better experience for you, and we can help you get the resources that you're looking for a lot easier. Did anybody have any questions?
So there was a question in the chat about Brian Deer being adapted by any communities outside of Canada, and if there were any similar systems developed to Brian Deer. As far as I know, there has not been an adaptation of Brian Deer outside of Canada. However, there have been conversations in Aotearoa about Maori subject headings and how to implement them. I don't know if they've actually gone to making an actual classification system, or how they've been able to adapt that within their own systems. And possibly in Australia, there are conversations happening as well. However, it's one thing about the implementation of Brian Deer is it is very localized and community based, and that's why on like a larger scale nationally in Canada, we are still having conversations about what to do about subject headings, because across Canada there are many different Indigenous communities, so we can't just like blanket terms on top of them. And so when it comes to smaller libraries, Brian Deer and the classification system works. When it comes to larger libraries like UBC, U of T, McGill, even public libraries, which usually use Dewey over Library of Congress, it is harder to actually do that. So that's kind of the thing about Brian Deer, is that we're very fortunate to be able to use it. But there are different committees across Canada that meet regularly to figure out what to do about subject headings. It's just, those are still conversations that are happening, and nothing necessarily concrete out of them, other than the Manitoba Archives have been able to do it through Maine. But yeah, that's also a small localized as well. So.
I see we have a question as well in the chat from Natalie Ullman. Natalie, did you want to unmute and ask, or did you want to type it in? Whatever you prefer.
Hi there. Yes, I'm happy to ask it myself, and it's really because it's less of a question and more of a comment. I'm a visiting scholar in the law school this year, and I have to thank you both, because I've never seen a presentation by librarians on TK, and it's a crucial subject, and you've done a wonderful job of explaining how the Xwi7xwa system of classification, used at the same time as Library of Congress, enhances the researcher's ability to find the contemporary information that she might be looking for. I really didn't understand how the two systems interacted, and how it could increase the number of hits that you'd get and allow you to use contemporary language and self-chosen language by Indigenous communities in order to get at what you're looking for. So thank you very much for making that so clear.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting us to do this presentation. Very happy to do it. So.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is it's not the most exciting topic sometimes until you experience the ways that it doesn't work all the time. But I'm happy that it is having a positive impact, and it's being absorbed in a good way, because it is so important, and it's so important for all of you as law students. You're all going to lead EDC and then do amazing things, and we're doing great work now. And so it's good to be transparent about what's working and what's not working, and just kind of how the systems work.
Okay, we have a request from Lee that if everybody has recorded the contact information, can we please stop screen sharing for the Q&A portion? I'm sure we can do that. And we also have a question from Cassandra. for Carleen.
How many titles do you have classified?
Okay, so the question from Cassandra is for Carleen. Says, I am currently a second year at Allard, and I'm wondering if you have any advice on how to optimize these research platforms for legal research. I really enjoyed the shorthand keywords in your presentation.
I would start with the research guides just to see if, I guess just as a foundational place. And the only reason why I say that is because it's easier to see like what's sinking in and then what needs to be clarified. And then after that, I would touch base with like myself or both Kayla and I, and also the law library, and maybe going through like a very specific question so that you can kind of see like what's working, what's not working. For example, like I know at the law library, I'm showing you a problematic example, but the other day I found a resource at the law library and they're using the subject headings from Xwi7xwa that Eleanor Wellwood would have developed, right? And so it's just, we're just kind of showing you a very quick snapshot. It's much more complicated, but.
Okay, and from Barbara, we have approximately how many titles do you have classified in both Library of Congress subject headings and Brian Deere?
That one's a bit harder to ask because I know, okay, so let's see. I've got, according to our website, we currently have approximately 12,000 items. So approximately 12,000 items would have the enhancement that Eleanor Wellwood would put on. So by enhancement, what I mean is, remember when I showed you the slide of the book, the resource, and then when you get it, then in order to really go through them quickly, technical services at UBC is just really quickly putting the Library of Congress subject headings on it. At Xwi7xwa, we have Eleanor, and she does the enhancement. She's the reason why we have all of this great stuff. And so with that, it's like so I know approximately 12,000 Eleanor would have touched. But at the same time, like I just saw an example from the law library where they've borrowed, like they've taken her record, not taken, but like we're sharing records. That's hard. I'm not sure. I'd have to figure out how many resources all of UBC has. Lots.
Yeah, probably hundreds of thousands. Like that would be all of our library system is for UBC libraries, all the monographs, books, like any type of publication that might be out on the shelf, as well as like ebooks, will have a Library of Congress subject heading associated with them, because that is the classification system that we use for the library. So any of our other branches will use it. So there's probably hundreds of, I tried looking it up and UBC does not have that information on their website. So I know some libraries do put roughly how many items are within their collection, but I wasn't able to find it just quickly trying to search, but there's lots and lots of books and any type of publication.
Sorry, I'm just seeing Barbara Bear's, so you take LC sub records and then, or sub records and then enhance on individual record. Yeah, so that's largely what our technical services is doing. We have, so at UBC Library, they have the tech services unit, and we're, to the best of my knowledge, the only branch that has an in-house. And so she gets them up and then has to go through each of those, and she adds in things that she thinks people are going to be looking for. And that's only for the subject headings. I mean, she also includes information like our table of contents is much more robust. She adds things like if it's a First Nations author, because we know that that's important to our patrons. And so it's very laborious, but she's doing it slowly.
I just want to ask sort of a question. So I'm just thinking back, Carleen, to the slide where you had the law book and the Xwi7xwa book side by side, and the Xwi7xwa book had Aboriginal Women Bill C-31 as one of our subject headings, but the law library did not. So I just want to confirm that means that if people are looking for legal research on Bill C-31, they will not find that title in the law library, even though it exists?
Yeah. So even sometimes, like I've seen, I was always teaching people, and I was spreading this misinformation where I would say, we do not use the subject heading Indians of North America. But then I found one, and I was thinking about why that decision would have been made. And I'm thinking because if you look at when you look at the item records, the titles, the subject headings, all those things are hyperlinked. And so Eleanor would have done that, because if you happen upon a problematic resource, you will get linked to it, to our stuff as well. So she's, you know, there's ways that you can kind of find those loopholes. But yeah, essentially, it's terrifying.
There's also, when it comes to like just on the terminology, when we're looking at legal resources, a lot of times you will find that more like what we would consider to be problematic terminology, because it is the actual name of the legislation. It's not called the Indigenous Act, it's called the Indian Act. So that's how we have to classify it. Or the Northwest Half-Breed Commission, it's not the Northwest Métis Commission, it's the Half-Breed Commission. So that's the way that we have to we have to catalog it so that it is findable, because that is the legal term that is used and the name of it. So that's kind of one of those situations where what we might see as problematic terminology to this date, it can't be changed because it literally would not be findable. And it also is not the name of it. So
All right, I've got a question for Kayla. And
yes.
again, I'm not a lawyer, so forgive me if I don't ask it totally clearly. I'm just thinking about the intersections between traditional knowledges, Indigenous knowledge, and the way that, you know, the collective community holds that knowledge and how that can't really be allowed for in the Copyright Act. Is there any examples that you're aware of where traditional and Indigenous knowledges are recognized and, you know, by the Copyright Act in a positive way?
So it's more when we see the cultural expressions. So anything that's like stories, art, dance, we'll normally see that being recognized more than like a knowledge. So even if we think about, say I produce a thesis and I interview individuals within my thesis, and I have traditional knowledge within my thesis. When I graduate from UBC and I deposit my thesis, I own the copyright on that, not the community that has their information in it, because it's the individual. So normally when we're seeing copyright actually working in favor, it's more those like artistic expressions, dances, songs, not so necessarily like an actual knowledge. So this is kind of the issue around it, and you know what constitutes as something that is, you know, able to be kind of covered under that copyright. So I know within the CFLA, we are doing some work on advising with the Canadian government, and this is through the Copyright Commission, on what to do about Indigenous knowledges that are not cultural expressions and how we can work towards that. But it's still something that is recurring and constantly coming up, more of the knowledge issue than dances or art forms when it comes to copyright. And even when I log into the Xwi7xwa meetings, that's something that's talked about, is like orally transmitted knowledge or knowledge from communities that's within like research or documentation where one person is claiming the copyright on it. I know that's kind of like a weird way to answer that, but yeah, sorry, Tamas, it's more the cultural expressions that get covered than the knowledge from any time that I've kind of seen it.
Okay. What implications would that have for the community that you were interviewing and their access to those materials in, you know, like the event that some catastrophe befell you and you held the copyright? Would they be able to access it, or would there be access implications then as well?
So when it comes to access of information, there's different kind of issues around that. So if it is something that is a digital object, like at UBC, we do have digital objects that are in our catalog. If it's something that is under a wall because of vendors, then that is an actual issue with the vendor. And I've signed like my author rights. I do have to talk when I publish something with vendors about paywalls. So if I have information from a community in there, but it's under a vendor paywall, then they still will not have access to that. With contemporary research, there is a lot more consideration of working with Indigenous communities through ethics boards, but really we didn't see ethics boards necessarily in Canada until kind of 60s, 70s, 80s. Even then, there are papers written about the kind of creation of research ethics boards in Canada, but without research ethics boards and really thinking about Indigenous people in there, it's one of those things where it's more on the good faith of the author to work in a respectful way with the community. However, there is the potential still for authors and researchers to not give communities access to information and just walk away and never return. And that's something that happened historically. It's something that we still see happening today. So this is why a lot of times we have to be mindful of the way that we practice when we do research, our relationships with communities, and work within a different framework. And so a lot of times you'll hear about those frameworks within like Indigenous research methodologies, text, or when you're working with, within kind of a lens of critical research. So yeah, it's still one of those things when you're working with communities that there is that protection that might be lacking, even though it's covered by research ethics boards. So yeah, it's access to information is a weird thing. It can be really good, or you might not get any access, just depending on what the document is or what is being produced. But I think there's also informed consent as well. So a lot of times, communities should be signing informed consent documents. These documents should be provided in languages that are understandable. So if you need to have a translator, you need to have a translator. If you're not doing your due diligence to, provide informed consent with communities, then, that is, in my opinion, unethical research. And then in contemporary research, that has to come up to the ethics board if you're not actually signing informed consent documentation. I hope that kind of answered your question, Tamis. It's a huge issue. Any type of research ethics is like a massive issue, especially with not just Indigenous communities, but all communities. And a lot of times research ethics are either too broad or too restrictive, depending on who you are and what kind of research you're doing. So.
Thank you, Kayla. It's actually very interesting to me because I always sort of thought copyright was a little bit dull prior to listening to you.
Oh yeah, copyright is like, it can be so interesting. It's one of those things that people are like, oh, copyright law, but then you're like, no, like there needs to be more Indigenous people or like great allies working within Indigenous copyright law. There are those who do it. And there are different organizations like iPinch. There are local contexts which develop the TK labels. I know Michael's on this call and he works with Mercadoo. And so like those communities, and there's some great academics in Aotearoa and Australia that are also doing work on intellectual property rights of Indigenous communities. But it's one of those things that it is slowly developing, and it is kind of a new thing that's being talked about a lot more, especially when we are living within a digital world. And I highly recommend the book, A Digital Bundle. as something if people are interested in kind of how we work within an ethical framework with Indigenous knowledges in a digital platform. It was born digital items. So now that everything's kind of online, and one of the big things we talk about in libraries is open access. But when it comes to Indigenous knowledges and other communities' knowledges, open access really does not work. It is something that, you know, it's community. Thank you for sharing that, Michael. It's community driven. And that's one thing that we forget about is it's not one person, it's a community that decides on what should be open and what not should be, depending on the protocols and their community's knowledge as well. So that's why it gets really tricky, but it's also very exciting work to be done. You know, maybe one day I'll go to law school. Who knows? I might get sick of libraries and just go to law school.
I think maybe
maybe like my tenure, I'll take a research sabbatical and go to law school.
Thank you so much. I just want to check before we wrap up here, because we've only got a few minutes left. Are there any other questions from any of our attendees?
I don't have a question. I just wanted to thank you both, and also for Thomas for saying, yes, we can do this again, because this sort of came out of in the summer, we had an intensive with our incoming Indigenous law students, and we invited the library staff to come and give a presentation. And afterwards, because it was so short, I was like, can you come again? They're like, yes, we can. So thank you guys for coming in. And I'd like to actually think and talk through with you about maybe in the new year, another session, you know, maybe getting more granular, you know, because I'm sure people are having these questions as they're looking for research at the library. Maybe we can get George involved as well, the librarian Allard, and do something combined, or I don't know. Anyway, thank you both. Thank you all for attending as well.
Thank you.